Tonight, we ride into the heart of the American frontier. Not the Hollywood version with perfect teeth and slow-motion duels, but the real, dusty, law-bending world of bounty hunters in the Wild West. These weren't caped vigilantes or noble sheriffs. They were men with itchy trigger fingers, questionable hygiene, and a knack for finding trouble on horseback. If you enjoy drifting off to sleep while someone calmly tells you about gunfights, double crosses, and the occasional accidental arrest of the wrong guy named Buck, then hit that subscribe button. And before you nod off, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there? We love knowing how far our history is wandering. Now, close your eyes and picture it. A creaky saloon door swings open with a groan that sounds like it's seen things. The air is thick with cigar smoke, spilled whiskey, and the kind of tension that makes poker chips clatter louder than they should. Outside, the wind kicks up dust devils that dance past wooden storefronts and horses tied to hitching posts. A wanted poster flaps lazily on the wall, its corners curled like it's tired of being ignored. The face on it is rough, the reward generous, and the words, "Dead or alive," stamped like a challenge. Boot steps echo on the boardwalk, measured, heavy, and not in a hurry. That's not a sheriff. That's someone who doesn't wear a badge, but still gets paid to shoot people. That, dear listener, is a bounty hunter. A hired gun paid to bring men back dead or alive. Out in the Wild West, justice wasn't always about law, it was about location. If the sheriff was 3 towns over, and the telegraph line was down, which it usually was, thanks to some drunk horse or a very determined woodpecker, then justice had to be outsourced. Enter the bounty hunter, part detective, part mercenary, part guy who really needs the money. And here's where things got murky. Because while some bounty hunters were noble-ish, tracking down murderers, horse thieves, and that one guy who kept stealing pies from windowsills, others were less, upholding justice, and more, freelance murder enthusiast. The line between catching a criminal and becoming one was thinner than a saloon napkin. Some bounty hunters brought in their targets alive, sure. Others brought back a boot, a hat, and a very convincing story. He drew first, they'd say, while casually wiping blood off their saddle horn. And who was going to argue? The only witness was a cactus. The truth is, bounty hunting was a business, and like any business, it had overhead, competition, and the occasional need to shoot someone in the back. The wanted posters didn't help either. Dead or alive wasn't exactly a strong endorsement of due process. It was more like a coupon for violence with flexible redemption terms. And let's not forget the townsfolk, who were usually just happy someone was doing something. Sure, he shot Jed in the leg, but Jed was wanted for stealing a mule. Or maybe it was a hat. Either way, close enough. In a land where the nearest judge was a week's ride away, and the jury was usually just whoever was sober at the time, justice became a matter of convenience. And if that meant hiring a guy with a 6-shooter and a flexible moral compass, so be it. The law was often too far, so the price of justice was negotiable. And oh, was it negotiable. In the Wild West, justice wasn't so much blind as it was nearsighted and easily distracted by whiskey. If you were a rancher whose cattle kept disappearing, or a saloon owner tired of being robbed by the same guy named Slim every Thursday, you didn't wait for a marshal to ride in from 3 counties over. You hired someone with a gun, a horse, and a flexible relationship with morality. Justice became a matter of budget. Couldn't afford a bounty hunter. Well, maybe your cousin Earl with the lazy eye, and a shotgun would do it for half price, and a bottle of rye. And the bounty hunters, they weren't exactly picky. Some were ex-soldiers, some were ex-outlaws, and some were just guys who looked good in dusters and needed a job. They'd ride into town, squint at a wanted poster, and say, "Yep, I can shoot that guy." Whether they brought him in hogtied or horizontal was mostly a matter of weather and mood. The townsfolk didn't ask too many questions. If the bad guy was gone, and the general store stopped getting robbed, that was good enough. Due process was more of a suggestion than a requirement. And if the bounty hunter accidentally shot the wrong guy, well, maybe he looked guilty. Or maybe he had a suspicious mustache. Either way, the paperwork was minimal. But to understand how this all came to be, how a nation ended up outsourcing justice to men with questionable hygiene and excellent aim, we have to go back a bit. Back to a country fresh out of civil war, bursting with ambition, and looking westward with stars in its eyes and revolvers on its hips. What was the Wild West, really? Post-Civil War America, west of the Mississippi. Where the land was wide, the law was thin. And everyone had a horse, but no one had a therapist. West of the Mississippi was like a national midlife crisis on horseback. The war was over, the Union was preserved, and suddenly everyone looked west and thought, "You know what I need. A fresh start, a plot of land, and maybe a shootout or two." The Mississippi River wasn't just a body of water. It was a psychological line. East of it, you had cities, factories, and people who wore shoes. West of it, opportunity, danger, and a whole lot of dust. The government, eager to populate the vast, empty-ish spaces, passed laws like the Homestead Act of 1862, which basically said, "Hey, you want 160 acres of land. Just promise to live on it, build something, and try not to die of dysentery." And people came. Farmers, freedmen, immigrants, ex-soldiers, and folks who just really hated their neighbors back east. They poured across the plains in wagons, on horseback and occasionally on foot, dragging dreams, livestock, and a deeply misplaced sense of optimism. But here's the thing, the land wasn't exactly empty. Native American tribes had been living there for centuries, and they weren't thrilled about the sudden influx of fence, building, buffalo, shooting settlers. Tensions rose. Treaties were broken faster than a saloon mirror during a bar fight, and the U.S. Army found itself playing an increasingly violent game of whose land is it anyway? Meanwhile, the railroads were stretching westward like steel tentacles, bringing with them jobs, towns, and a surprising number of train robbers. Every time a new rail line was completed, a town would spring up overnight, complete with a saloon, a general store, and at least one guy named Buck, who claimed to be a dentist, but definitely wasn't. These towns were often lawless, chaotic, and built entirely out of wood and bad decisions. And speaking of lawlessness, let's talk about the legal system. Or rather, the lack of one. The West didn't have a unified legal structure. It had territories, which were like states but with fewer rules and more gunfights. Each territory had its own patchwork of laws, often enforced by whoever was sober enough to hold a badge. Town marshals were elected, appointed, or just kind of showed up one day and declared themselves in charge. Some were brave. Some were corrupt. Some were just really good at looking intimidating in a hat. If you were lucky, your town had a marshal. If you were really lucky, he wasn't also the town drunk. And if you were unbelievably lucky, he could read. But most of the time, justice was handled by posses, vigilantes, or that one guy who claimed to have studied law back east, but actually just read half a newspaper once. And then there were the railroads. Oh, the railroads. They were the arteries of expansion, pumping people, goods, and chaos into the frontier. Railroad companies had their own security forces, their own rules, and occasionally their own towns. If you messed with the railroad, you weren't just breaking the law. You were interrupting capitalism. And that was a hanging offense. So what did all this mean for the average settler? It meant that justice was inconsistent. unpredictable, and often arrived on horseback with a shotgun. It meant that if you were robbed, you might have to chase the thief yourself. And if you were accused of something, your trial might consist of a group of angry townsfolk and a coin toss. Because out here, in the wild, Wild West, no unified law system, territories, town marshals, railroads expanding, and everyone just kind of hoped for the best. Crime was rampant, cattle rustling, bank robbing, murder, and not the polite, white-collar kind of crime where someone embezzles funds while sipping espresso. No, this was the kind of crime where someone stole your horse, your wallet, and your boots while you were still wearing them. The Wild West was less yee-haw and more, oh no, he's got a gun. Let's start with cattle rustling. In the East, people stole jewelry. In the West, they stole livestock. Because out here, a cow wasn't just a cow. It was currency, dinner, and transportation insurance all rolled into one mooing package. Rustlers would sneak onto ranches at night, drive off herds, and vanish into the hills like beef-loving ninjas. Ranchers responded by branding their cattle, hiring armed guards, and occasionally forming posses that looked like angry barbershop quartets with rifles. Then there were the bank robbers. These guys were the rock stars of frontier crime. They'd ride into town, masks on, guns drawn, and demand cash with the kind of confidence usually reserved for toddlers asking for candy. Some were smooth, others were disasters. One infamous outlaw tried to rob a bank, got stuck in the window, and had to be pulled out by his own gang. Another left a note with his real name on it. Criminal masterminds they were not. But the most common crime? Good old-fashioned murder. Disputes over poker games, land, cattle, or someone looking at someone else's boots the wrong way often ended in gunfire. The saloon was basically a combination of bar, courtroom, and occasional crime scene. He cheated at cards. Bang. He insulted my horse. Bang. He drank the last of the whiskey. Bang, bang. It was less about justice and more about who had the faster draw and the better aim. And let's not forget the traveling criminals. Con men, snake oil salesmen, and drifters with more aliases than teeth. They'd roll into town with a wagon full of miracle elixirs, promised to cure everything from baldness to heartbreak, and disappear just before the townsfolk realized they'd bought flavored water and lies. Law enforcement, bless their underpaid souls, couldn't keep up. Sheriffs were often outnumbered, outgunned, and occasionally out to lunch. Literally. Some towns didn't even have a sheriff, just a guy named Clint, who once punched a bear and now wore a badge. So when crime happened, and it always happened, justice had to be improvised. Which brings us to the West's favorite legal doctrine. Frontier justice: shoot first, trial maybe later. And if there was a trial, it usually involved a coin toss, a bottle of whiskey, and someone yelling, "He had it coming." It wasn't just a saying, it was a lifestyle. In the Wild West, if someone stole your horse, insulted your sister, or looked at your beans the wrong way, the response was often swift, loud, and involved at least one revolver. The idea of due process was charming in theory, but in practice, it was usually outrun by a bullet. Trials were rare, lawyers even rarer, and the concept of innocent until proven guilty often depended on whether the accused could duck fast enough. This wasn't because people were inherently lawless. Well, not all of them, but because the infrastructure for justice simply didn't exist. Courthouses were few and far between. Judges were often traveling on horseback, and jails were more like suggestions than secure facilities. If someone committed a crime, the townsfolk didn't wait for a warrant. They grabbed their rifles, formed a posse, and headed out with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for pie-eating contests. And let's be honest, sometimes the justice was more about personal grudges than actual law breaking. "He stole my cow!" "No, I didn't." Bang. "Well, now he definitely won't do it again." Problem solved, sort of. But this wasn't just chaos for chaos's sake. Believe it or not, there was a legal foundation for this kind of behavior. One that stretched all the way back to merry old England. Because when the settlers crossed the Atlantic, they didn't just bring tea and smallpox. They brought common law. And in that common law were two very handy concepts: hue and cry, and pos comitatus. Because nothing says organized justice like yelling loudly and chasing someone with pitchforks. Back in merry old England, where the mud was thick, the teeth were optional, and everyone seemed to be named either Joffrey or Margaret. The seeds of Wild West justice were quietly being planted. You see, long before bounty hunters were galloping across the plains, with wanted posters flapping in the wind, English common law had already laid the groundwork for chasing bad guys with pitchforks and righteous indignation. Let's start with the hue and cry. This wasn't a medieval boy band or a particularly dramatic soap opera. It was the legal requirement that if you saw a crime happening, you had to yell about it, loudly, publicly, preferably while running. If someone stole a chicken, you didn't just mutter, "Oh dear," and go back to your turnips. No, you had to shout, "THIF," at the top of your lungs and hope the neighbors joined in like a very angry flash mob. Everyone within earshot was legally obligated to drop what they were doing, be it farming, blacksmithing, or aggressively dying of the plague, and help chase the criminal down. If you ignored the hue and cry, you could be fined. That's right. Not yelling was a crime. Imagine that today. "Sir, you failed to scream during the robbery. That'll be £50 and a strongly worded scroll." Then there was pos comitatus, which sounds like a spell from Harry Potter, but is actually Latin for power of the county. This gave sheriffs the authority to summon every able-bodied man in the area to help enforce the law. It was like jury duty, but with more swords and fewer excuses. If the sheriff needed help catching a bandit, he'd round up a posse. Basically a medieval neighborhood watch with torches and a thirst for justice. And if you refused to join, you could be fined, imprisoned, or just glared at very sternly by the local reeve. These concepts crossed the Atlantic with the early colonists, who brought with them not just their dreams of freedom and religious expression, but also their deep love of yelling and forming mobs. As America expanded westward, the hue and cry evolved into the town posse, and the pos comitatus became the sheriff's go-to move when things got rowdy. There's been a stagecoach robbery. Quick, round up the blacksmith, the bartender, and that guy who always smells like beans. But here's where things got spicy. By the 19th century, America had grown tired of relying solely on civic duty and neighborly yelling. The frontier was too big, the criminals too fast, and the sheriffs too underpaid. So the government, and occasionally private citizens, decided to sweeten the deal. Enter cash payments for capture. Yes, the bounty. Cold, hard, morally ambiguous cash. Suddenly, you didn't need to be a sheriff, or even particularly law-abiding to chase down fugitives. All you needed was a gun, a horse, and a strong stomach for ethical grey areas. Posters went up offering rewards for outlaws. 500 for Jesse James, dead or alive. And just like that, bounty hunting became a career path. Not a respectable one, mind you, but definitely one with flexible hours and a decent dental plan. Assuming you didn't get shot in the face. These laws varied by state and territory, but the idea was simple: bring in the bad guy, get paid. No questions asked. Well, maybe a few questions, like, is this the right guy? And why is he missing a toe? But generally speaking, if you delivered a criminal, preferably breathing, but not necessarily you got your reward. It was capitalism meets vigilante justice, with a dash of frontier flair. And so, the bounty system was born, not out of noble ideals or legal brilliance, but out of sheer logistical desperation, and the universal truth that people will do anything for money. 19th century laws turned the Wild West into a freelance crime fighting economy, where every man with a mustache and a revolver fancied himself a hero. In the 19th century United States, lawmakers took one look at the chaos of the frontier and said, "You know what this needs? Incentives." And thus, the bounty system was born, not out of some grand vision of justice, but because paying people to catch criminals was cheaper than sending actual lawmen across 400 miles of cactus and regret. The laws were simple. If you brought in a wanted man, you got paid. How you brought him in, hogtied, unconscious, or slightly annoyed, wasn't always specified. The posters said, "Dead or alive." And that wasn't just poetic flair. It was a legal shrug. Would prefer alive, but hey, we're not picky. These cash for capture laws turned the American West into a freelance justice economy. Suddenly, every man with a revolver and a questionable mustache fancied himself a bounty hunter. Some were former soldiers. Some were ex-outlaws looking to flip the script. Some were just guys who really liked the idea of getting paid to shoot people and didn't ask too many questions. And the rewards, they varied. A petty thief might fetch 25. A notorious outlaw, hundreds. Jesse James had a price on his head that could buy you a ranch, a saloon, and a lifetime supply of beans. The bigger the bounty, the more motivated the hunters became. And by motivated, we mean willing to shoot first and fill out paperwork never. But this wasn't just a free-for-all. Well, okay, it was a free-for-all, but there were also official players in the game. Because while bounty hunters were out there, chasing down fugitives with nothing but a poster and a prayer, there were also sheriffs, marshals, Pinkertons, and unaffiliated hunters, all trying to enforce the law, or at least get paid trying. Out on the frontier, law enforcement was less of a structured institution and more of a chaotic buffet. You had your sheriffs, your marshals, your Pinkertons, and then, just to keep things spicy, a whole bunch of unaffiliated hunters who basically woke up one day, strapped on a revolver, and said, "I enforce the law now. Let's start with the sheriffs." These were the local boys, elected by the townsfolk, which meant their qualifications ranged from former Civil War hero to owns a hat and can spell justice on the first try. Sheriff were responsible for everything from the criminals to collecting taxes to occasionally sweeping the boardwalk. Some were brave, some were corrupt, some were just really good at looking stern while leaning against a post. Their authority ended at the county line, which meant if a criminal crossed into the next jurisdiction, the sheriff had to either give up the chase or awkwardly ask the next sheriff over if they could borrow a posse. Then you had the marshals, the federal flavor of lawmen. U.S. Marshals were appointed by the Attorney General and had the authority to enforce federal law across territories. They were the big guns, literally and figuratively. Marshals could deputize locals, form posses, and chase fugitives across state lines like it was a national sport. But don't let the title fool you. Many marshals were underpaid, overworked, and occasionally had to deliver mail or take the census between shootouts. One day they'd be arresting a train robber. The next they'd be counting how many goats lived in a canyon. And then came the Pinkertons. Oh boy. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was like the Amazon Prime of 19th century justice. Fast, efficient, and slightly terrifying. Founded by Alan Pinkerton, this private agency was hired by railroads, banks, and anyone with enough money to say, "I'd like my criminals removed, please." The Pinkertons were detectives, bounty hunters, and occasionally full-blown mercenaries. They wore suits, carried guns, and had mustaches sharp enough to cut glass. They were relentless. If you were an outlaw, and the Pinkertons were after you, you had two options: run forever, or start digging your own grave. But even the Pinkertons had their limits. When they went after Jesse James, they accidentally blew up his mother's house with a firebomb. Public opinion turned faster than a spooked mule, and suddenly the Pinkertons weren't the dashing detectives. They were the guys who exploded a grandma. Oops. And finally, we arrive at the unaffiliated hunters. These were the freelancers of frontier justice. No badge, no boss, just a gun, a horse, and a dream. Some were former lawmen. Some were ex-cons. Some were just really enthusiastic about shooting people for money. They'd roll into town, squint at a wanted poster, and say, "Yep, I can probably find this guy. Or someone who looks like him." Close enough. These unaffiliated bounty hunters operated in a legal gray area the size of Texas. They weren't officially sanctioned, but they weren't exactly not sanctioned either. As long as they brought in the right guy, or at least someone with a similar hat, most towns were happy to pay up and ask no further questions. And if they brought in the wrong guy, well, mistakes happen. Especially when everyone's named Buck and has a mustache. But here's where things got really dicey: the wanted posters. You've seen them in every Western movie. Sepia-toned, slightly crumpled, with a sketch of a scowling man and the words, "Wanted." DEEDORLIV, stamped across the bottom like a legal shrug. These posters were everywhere, tacked to saloon walls, nailed to trees, fluttering in the wind like invitations to a very violent party. And they were legally vague. Dangerously so. Because what exactly did "dead or alive" mean? Was it a suggestion? A legal loophole? A polite way of saying, "We don't care how you do it, just get it done"? The answer was yes. And also no. And also, it depends on who's asking, and whether the sheriff's in a good mood. Wanted posters with DEEDORIV were legally vague and deadly. Because when the law can't make up its mind, someone usually ends up full of lead. These posters were the Wild West's version of a legal memo written in crayon. They were slapped on saloon walls, nailed to trees, and fluttered on every sheriff's bulletin board like ominous party invitations. The phrase, "dead or alive," was printed in bold, dramatic letters, as if the law itself had thrown up its hands and said, "Look, just bring him in, okay?" But here's the kicker: that phrase was about as legally binding as a pinky promise. In most cases, it wasn't issued by a court or a government agency. It was posted by railroads, banks, or private companies like the Pinkertons, who were less interested in due process and more interested in not getting robbed again. The wording was intentionally vague, a sort of legal shrug that said, "We're not telling you to shoot him, but we're also not telling you." And bounty hunters, they loved it. Dead or alive gave them wiggle room the size of Texas. If they brought the outlaw in alive, great, less paperwork. If they brought him in dead, well, the poster did say it was an option. Of course, this led to some creative interpretations. He reached for his gun, they'd say, while the outlaw lay face down with a sandwich in his hand. He looked suspicious, they'd claim, pointing to a guy who just happened to have the same hat. The legal system, such as it was, mostly looked the other way. As long as the right body showed up and the reward was claimed, few questions were asked. But every now and then, someone would push it too far. Like the Ford brothers, who shot Jesse James in the back while he was adjusting a picture frame. They tried to collect the bounty. Instead, they got arrested. Turns out, even in the Wild West, there were some lines you couldn't cross. Or at least, not without a really good excuse and a sheriff who owed you a favor. So while Dead or Alive made for a thrilling headline, it was legally murky, morally questionable, and often deadly. It turned bounty hunting into a high-stakes game of coup with bullets. Which brings us to the mechanics behind the madness. How the bounty system worked. Lawmen posted rewards for capture or killing. And suddenly, justice had a price tag and a very flexible return policy. Lawmen posted rewards for capture or killing. And suddenly the American frontier turned into the world's most dangerous job board. You didn't need a rare some, just a revolver, a horse, and a strong stomach. Sheriffs, marshals, and even private citizens would slap up posters offering cold, hard cash for the return of outlaws. And they weren't shy about the terms. 500 for Billy the Kid, dead or alive. That's not a legal nuance. That's a polite way of saying, we'll take him breathing, but we're not picky. These rewards weren't just for the big names either. Horse thieves, stagecoach robbers, and anyone who made the mistake of stealing from the wrong saloon could find their face nailed to a tree with a dollar amount underneath. And the best part, you didn't even have to be a lawman to collect. If you were a ranch hand with a good aim and a flexible moral compass, congratulations, you were now in the bounty business. But this wasn't a handshake deal. Oh no. The West may have been wild, but it still loved its paperwork. To collect your reward, you had to prove you got the right guy. And that's where things got creative. Payment only upon proof, see body, ears affidavits, etc. Because nothing says justice served like mailing someone's ear with a notarized note. You see, in the Wild West, you didn't just stroll into the sheriff's office, tip your hat, and say, "I done caught me a bandit. Now where's my money?" No, sir. You had to prove it. And not just with a firm handshake and a confident mustache. The law, and more importantly, the people paying the reward, wanted receipts, and in the 1800s, receipts came in some truly unsettling forms. The most straightforward proof, the body. Dragging the outlaw's corpse into town was the gold standard of bounty verification. It was dramatic, undeniable, and made for a great photo op7s if you happened to have a camera and a very patient outlaw. But bodies were heavy, smelly, and had a tendency to decompose inconveniently during long rides through the desert. Not to mention, transporting a corpse across state lines raised a few eyebrows, and a lot of vultures. So some bounty hunters got inventive. Enter the ear method. Yes, really. In some cases, especially in remote areas, or when the bounty was posted by private citizens or companies, hunters would lop off an ear or toot as proof of capture. It was lightweight, portable, and, let's be honest, deeply unsettling. Here's Jed's left ear. The hunter would say, placing it on the sheriff's desk like a grotesque business card. You'll find it matches the sketch on the poster. And if the sheriff was feeling particularly thorough, he might compare it to the wanted poster, like a grim game of Mr. Potato Head. But not everyone was keen on body parts. Some jurisdictions preferred affidavits, sworn statements from witnesses, lawmen, or the hunter himself. These were more civilized, less gooey, and could be filed away in a drawer instead of a jar. Of course, affidavits could be forged, bribed, or written by someone who thought perjury was a type of stew. Still, they added a veneer of legality to the whole affair, which was often enough to satisfy the folks holding the purse strings. In some cases, bounty hunters had to provide multiple forms of proof: a body and an affidavit, or a live capture and a witness statement. And if the outlaw was brought in alive, even more paperwork. You had to prove he was the right guy, not just someone who looked vaguely criminal and had the misfortune of being in the wrong saloon at the wrong time. Mistaken identity was a real risk, especially when everyone wore the same hat and had the same squinty glare. And here's where things got legally spicy. If you brought in the wrong person, or if the bounty wasn't properly posted, or if you couldn't prove your claim, you didn't just lose the reward. You could be arrested for kidnapping, murder, or impersonating law enforcement. That's right. 1 minute you're the hero of the town, the next you're in a cell next to the guy you thought was the outlaw. Because in the bounty business, it wasn't just about catching the bad guy. It was about catching the right bad guy, in the right way, with the right paperwork. Which is why hunters needed to check bounty legitimacy, or risk jail themselves. Because nothing ruins a payday like accidentally committing a felony. In the Wild West, bounty hunters weren't just chasing outlaws, they were also dodging legal landmines. You couldn't just grab a guy off a bar stool, tie him to your saddle, and ride into town yelling, "I got him!" Well, you could, but if it turned out he wasn't actually wanted, or worse, the bounty was fake, you might find yourself swapping places with your prisoner in the local jail. See, not all wanted posters were created equal. Some were official, posted by sheriffs or marshals. Others were, let's say, entrepreneurial. A disgruntled rancher might slap up a poster offering 100 for Jed the fence jumper, who may or may not have just borrowed a shovel and forgotten to return it. If a bounty hunter didn't double check the legitimacy of that reward, he could end up being charged with kidnapping, assault, or general buffoonery in the first degree. And the courts weren't always sympathetic. So you tackled a man in broad daylight, tied him up, and dragged him across county lines because someone said he looked like a guy named Slim. Not exactly a rock-solid defense. Hunters had to be careful, verify the bounty, confirm the identity, and ideally not shoot anyone who was just trying to buy beans. But here's the kicker. There was no central database, no hotline, no laminated badge that said, Certified Bounty Professional. If you wanted to be a bounty hunter, you didn't need a license, a background check, or even a basic understanding of the law. No standard licensing. Anyone could call themselves a bounty hunter. All you needed was a gun, a horse, and the confidence of a man who's never read a legal textbook. In the Wild West, there was no official badge, no laminated ID card, and certainly no online certification course titled, "So you wanna be a bounty hunter?" If you had a gun, a horse, and the confidence of a man who once wrestled a bear and maybe lost, congratulations. You were now in the fugitive recovery business. There was no federal registry, no background check, and no training requirement. You didn't need to know the law. You just needed to know how to shoot, track, and not ask too many questions. Some bounty hunters were former soldiers. Others were ex-outlaws who figured, why run from the law when you can get paid to chase it? And some were just guys named Dusty, who smelled like beans and had a strong opinion about rope knots. This lack of regulation led to a colorful cast of characters. You had bounty hunters who were noble and disciplined, and others who were basically chaos in a cowboy hat. Some were legends. Others were walking lawsuits. And since there was no licensing board to revoke, even the worst bounty hunter could just ride into the next town, change his name to Tex Lightning, and start fresh. The result? A profession that was equal parts law enforcement, mercenary work, and improv theater. And while some bounty hunters took their job seriously, tracking fugitives with skill and precision, others treated it like a scavenger hunt with bullets. The only real qualification was a willingness to get shot at before breakfast. But even the most unlicensed, unqualified bounty hunter needed the right gear. Because when you're chasing armed criminals across the desert with no backup and questionable hygiene, You don't just bring a smile and a dream. You bring the bounty hunter's tools and tactics, revolvers, repeating rifles, ropes, shackles. Because nothing says, "I'm here to help," like a 6-shooter and a length of hemp. When it came to tools of the trade, bounty hunters didn't travel light. They were walking arsenals with a side of rope. First up, revolvers. The Colt single-action army, also known as the Peacemaker, which is hilarious considering how many people it unpieced, was the sidearm of choice. It was reliable, easy to use, and made a very persuasive argument in any negotiation. Most bounty hunters carried at least one, often two, and occasionally three if they had trust issues and a good tailor. Then there were repeating rifles, like the Winchester Model 1873, affectionately called the gun that won the West. It could fire multiple rounds without reloading, which was handy when your target had friends, cousins, or a particularly aggressive goat. These rifles were the long-range solution to the age-old problem of, "He's running and I don't feel like chasing him." Ropes were essential, not just for tying up fugitives, but also for dramatic entrances, makeshift repairs, and the occasional impromptu lasso competition while waiting for a train. A good bounty hunter could hog-tie a man faster than you could say, "I swear I didn't do it." And if the rope didn't hold, well, that's what shackles were for. Heavy, clunky, and about as comfortable as sleeping on a cactus. Shackles were the bounty hunter's way of saying, "You're not going anywhere, partner." But all this gear was useless without one crucial companion, the horse. Not just any horse, mind you. Horses bred for speed and endurance were the real MVPs of the bounty business. Because when your payday is galloping over the horizon, you'd better be riding something that can keep up. When it came to bounty hunting, your horse wasn't just transportation. It was your partner, your getaway car, and occasionally your therapist. You didn't ride just any horse. You needed a beast bred for speed and endurance, the kind of animal that could gallop through a sandstorm, leap a cactus, and still have enough energy to glare at you for forgetting to pack oats. The American quarter horse was the sprinter of the West. Short bursts of speed that could catch a fleeing outlaw before he even finished yelling, "You'll never take me alive!" But if you were chasing someone across 3 counties and a mountain range, you needed an Arabian, sleek, tireless, and just judgmental enough to make you feel bad about your saddle posture. Some bounty hunters swore by the Appaloosa, with its spotted coat and stubborn streak, while others preferred the Akal Teak, a horse so shiny it looked like it had been dipped in gold and blessed by the sun. These horses weren't just fast, they were smart. They could sniff out a trail, dodge rattlesnakes, and somehow always knew which saloon had the best water trough. A good horse could mean the difference between catching your bounty or spending the night in a bush arguing with a raccoon over territory. But speed alone wasn't enough. Once you got close to your target, you needed more than horsepower. You needed tracking skills, bribing informants, ambushes, and maybe a little luck, a lot of coffee, and a face that said, "I'm not here to make friends." Tracking skills, bribing informants, ambushes. These were the bounty hunter's bread, butter, and occasional side of beans. Because once you had your revolver, your rope, and your horse with a grudge against uphill terrain, the next step was figuring out where your target had gone. And that's where the real work began. Tracking wasn't just about following footprints in the dirt like some dusty Sherlock Holmes. It was an art, a science, a sweaty, sunburned guessing game. Bounty hunters learned to read the land like a book, written in hoofprints, broken twigs, and suspiciously flattened grass. A bent blade of prairie grass. He passed through here 2 hours ago. A half-buried sardine tin. He's got terrible taste in snacks and a head start. Some hunters could tell if a man was limping, drunk, or just really indecisive, based on the way his boot prints zigzagged through the sagebrush. But when the trail went cold, or the fugitive got clever, it was time to switch tactics. Bribing informants was the next best thing to actual detective work. Saloon bartenders, stable boys, traveling salesmen. And that one guy who always seemed to be sweeping the same patch of dirt. They all had ears, and for the right price, they'd use them. A few coins, a bottle of whiskey, or the promise of not getting shot was often enough to loosen tongues. "Yeah, I seen him," they'd say, squinting dramatically. "Came through here 2 nights ago. Smelled like beans and bad decisions." And then there were ambushes. The bounty hunter's favorite way to say, "Surprise. Why risk a shootout when you could just wait behind a rock, a tree, or a conveniently placed hay bale?" Hunters would stake out watering holes, hide in abandoned cabins, or crouch in the shadows of outhouses, not glamorous, but effective. The goal wasn't honor, it was efficiency. And if that meant jumping a man while he was relieving himself, or halfway through a snore, so be it. Because let's be honest, bounty hunters weren't in the business of fair fights. They weren't knights. They weren't duelists. They were freelancers with a deadline and a wanted poster that didn't say anything about sportsmanship. Rarely involved in fair fights, preferred to catch them sleeping, because nothing says justice like waking up hogtied and confused. They were rarely involved in fair fights, because fair fights were for people with backup plans and health insurance. Bounty hunters didn't have the luxury of honor duels at high noon. They had deadlines, dust in their boots, and a strong preference for not getting shot in the spleen. So, instead of announcing themselves with a dramatic draw, they preferred the more practical approach. Wait until the outlaw was asleep, drunk, bathing, or ideally all three. Catching a fugitive mid-snore was the dream scenario. No bullets flying, no horses bolting, no dramatic last words, just a quick hog tea, and a long ride back to town with a very confused man asking, "Wait, what day is it?" Some bounty hunters even developed a sixth sense for when their target was about to fall asleep. He's eaten beans, he's taken off his boots, and he's humming. Yep, he's about to drift off. Time to pounce. And if the outlaw was awake, well, then it was all about surprise. Bounty hunters would hide in haystacks, crouch behind outhouses, or pretend to be traveling salesmen selling miracle hair tonic. Anything to get close enough to slap on the shackles before the bullets started flying. Because once the shooting started, things got messy, and messy meant paperwork, witnesses, and possibly a bullet in the leg. But here's where things got ethically squishy. Because while the posters said, "dead or alive," bringing someone back alive was a whole lot harder, and a whole lot riskier. A live outlaw could fight back, escape, or spend the entire ride back to town insulting your horse. A dead outlaw, quiet, cooperative, and unlikely to sue. Dead or alive, the grey ethics. Because sometimes the difference between justice and convenience was just a well-aimed shot. Dragging a living, breathing outlaw across the desert wasn't just a logistical nightmare. It was a full contact rodeo with legal consequences. A live fugitive could kick, bite, lie, bribe, or suddenly remember he was a black belt in frontier jiu-jitsu. He might try to escape in the middle of the night, charm a sympathetic bartender into cutting his ropes, or simply talk so much that the bounty hunter began to question all his life choices. And let's not forget the paperwork. Bringing someone in alive meant affidavits, witness statements, and the possibility that the outlaw might actually stand trial and, heaven forbid, get acquitted. Nothing sawed a bounty hunter's day like watching a man. He risked his neck to capture walk free, because the judge was his cousin, and the jury was drunk. Then there was the matter of transport. A live outlaw needed food, water, and bathroom breaks. A dead one, just a tarp and a strong stomach. And if the outlaw had friends, which they often did, those friends might come looking. A bounty hunter riding into town with a corpse was making a statement. Riding in with a prisoner. That was an invitation for a jailbreak, a shootout, or at the very least, a strongly worded letter from the outlaw's mother. So, some bounty hunters, let's say the more pragmatic ones, started leaning into the dead part of dead or alive. After all, a corpse doesn't argue. It doesn't escape. It doesn't sue you for excessive force. And if anyone asked too many questions, well, the outlaw looked like he was reaching for his gun. Or maybe he sneezed too aggressively. Or maybe the bounty hunter just had a twitchy trigger finger and a very creative imagination, which is how we ended up with a not so rare phenomenon on the frontier: some accidentally shot targets to avoid risk, because nothing says "foops" like a bullet hole and a perfectly timed shrug. And by accidentally, we mean conveniently, strategically, or foops. My finger slipped while he was unarmed and sneezing. Bounty hunters in the Wild West had a knack for turning tense situations into one-sided conclusions. If a fugitive so much as twitched near his belt buckle, that was enough to justify a bullet. He reached for something, the bounty hunter would say. Could have been a gun, could have been a harmonica. I wasn't about to find out. The truth was, bringing someone in alive was a logistical nightmare. You had to feed them, water them, keep them from escaping, and, worst of all, listen to them complain the entire ride back. I didn't do it, they'd say. You got the wrong guy? They'd insist. Please stop tying the rope so tight. They'd whine. It was exhausting. A dead outlaw, on the other hand, was quiet, compact, and didn't require bathroom breaks. So when a bounty hunter accidentally shot a target, it was often less about danger and more about convenience. And if the outlaw had a reputation, even better. He was dangerous, the hunter would say. Real twitchy. Probably had a knife, or a curse, or both. And just like that, the paperwork got easier, the reward got paid, and the outlaw got a pine box. Now, you might think towns would be outraged by this kind of behavior, that they'd demand justice, accountability, or at least a strongly worded telegram. But more often than not, towns turned blind eyes if the result was convenient. Because when the saloon stops getting robbed, nobody asks too many questions about how. And boy, was it convenient a lot. In the Wild West, justice wasn't always about truth. It was about results. If a bounty hunter rode into town, with a body slung over his saddle, and a wanted poster in hand, most folks didn't ask too many questions.
Is that really the guy?
Did he get a trial? Why is he missing his boots and also his head? These were not questions people wanted to dwell on, especially if the saloon had just reopened and the stagecoach robberies had mysteriously stopped. Sheriffs, mayors, and even judges often looked the other way if the outcome made their lives easier. Less crime? Great. One less outlaw, even better. And if the bounty hunter happened to be a little trigger, happy, or had a suspiciously vague explanation like, he reached for something shiny, well, who were they to argue? After all, the town budget didn't exactly allow for lengthy investigations or forensic science. If the corpse vaguely resembled the sketch on the poster and wasn't actively robbing anyone at the moment, that was good enough. And let's not forget the townsfolk. They weren't exactly clamoring for due process either. If someone had been terrorizing the area, stealing cattle, robbing banks, or just being generally unpleasant, then seeing that person hauled in or dragged in was cause for celebration. He got what was coming, they'd say, while stepping over the body to get to the general store. Justice, in their eyes, was less about fairness and more about finality. But this casual attitude toward justice had a dark side. Because when no one's asking questions, it's dangerously easy to get the wrong answers. Or the wrong man. And that's when the stories started to surface, quietly, uneasily. About men who weren't outlaws at all. Men who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Men who looked a little too much like someone on a poster. Men who were worth more dead than alive. Stories of innocent men being killed for reward money. Because when justice is for sale, sometimes the receipt is written in blood. Stories of innocent men being killed for reward money weren't just tragic footnotes. They were the dark underbelly of a system that paid in cash and asked questions later. In a world where dead or alive was printed in bold, and the only ID check was a squint and a shrug, mistakes were inevitable. And by mistakes, we mean horrifying miscarriages of justice with a receipt attached. Sometimes it was a case of mistaken identity. A man with the same hat, the same mustache, or the same unfortunate nicknames, Slim, Buck, or Lefty, could find himself on the wrong end of a rope. Other times, it was more sinister. Bounty hunters who knew full well they had the wrong man, but figured, close enough. After all, the poster didn't come with a photo, just a sketch that looked like every other guy west of the Mississippi. And towns, they didn't always care. If the crime stopped, if the saloon stayed unrobbed, if the cattle stopped disappearing, then maybe, just maybe, they were willing to overlook the fact that the man in the pine box had never actually committed a crime. He looked guilty, they'd say. He had shifty eyes. Or worse, well, he might have done something eventually. The system was ripe for abuse. Some bounty hunters became infamous for their efficiency, which was a polite way of saying they had a high body count and a low accuracy rate. And while some were eventually caught or run out of town, others became legends, men whose names were whispered with a mix of awe and unease. Which brings us to one of the most infamous figures of them, all legendary hunters of the frontier, Tom Horn, former scout turned killer, for hire, executed for murder. Because sometimes the line between lawman and outlaw was drawn in pencil, and Tom Horn brought the eraser. Now there's a resume that takes a turn. Tom Horn started out as a respected U.S. Army scout during the Apache Wars, even helping track down Geronimo. He was fluent in multiple Native American languages, a skilled tracker, and the kind of guy who could sneak through enemy lines with nothing but a rifle and a bad attitude. He later worked for the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which sounds fancy until you realize their job description often included solve crimes, break strikes, and maybe shoot someone if it helps. But Horn's real claim to fame, or infamy, was as a range detective, which is a polite way of saying hired gun. Cattle barons in Wyoming and Colorado paid him to deal with rustlers, and Tom took that job description very literally. He was known for giving suspects a warning, and if they didn't take it seriously, well, let's just say they didn't make that mistake twice. Horn claimed he never killed anyone who didn't deserve it, which is exactly what someone who killed a lot of people would say. His downfall came in 1901, when 14-year-old Willie Nickel was shot near his family's ranch. Horn, who had been drinking a lot at the time, allegedly confessed to the murder in a slurred conversation with a detective. That confession, along with a whole lot of public pressure, landed him on the gallows in 1903. To this day, historians argue whether he actually did it, or was just the most convenient scapegoat with a trigger finger and a reputation. Horn died the day before his 43rd birthday, hanged in Cheyenne, Wyoming. His last words were reportedly, "Killing men is my specialty. I look at it as a business proposition." Which, frankly, is not the kind of thing you want on your LinkedIn profile. But not all frontier legends were so morally murky. Some wore the badge with honor, hunted criminals with integrity, and brought in thousands of fugitives without ever crossing the line. Enter the legend himself, Bass Reeves, former slave turned U.S. Marshal, brought in 3,000 men. Because sometimes the good guys really wore the badge and meant it. Now that's a career arc. Born into slavery in 1838 in Crawford County, Arkansas, Bass Reeves escaped bondage during the Civil War, allegedly after punching his enslaver during a card game and fleeing into Indian Territory, which is already the most action, hero origin story in U.S. martial history. There, he learned the languages and customs of the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole tribes, skills that would later make him one of the most effective lawmen in the West. In 1875, Reeves was appointed as a deputy U.S. Marshal by the infamous hanging judge, Isaac Parker, who basically handed him a badge and said, "Good luck. The territory's 75,000 square miles and full of people who don't like being arrested." And Bass, he thrived. Over a 32-year career, he arrested more than 3,000 fugitives, killed at least 14 in self-defense, and once even brought in his own son for murder. That's right. When your dad is Bass Reeves, you don't get a stern lecture. You get handcuffed and a ride to court. Reeves was known for his cunning disguises, ironclad sense of justice, and the kind of mustache that could intimidate a rattlesnake. He was a crack shot, a master tracker, and a man of unshakable integrity. He couldn't read or write, so he memorized every warrant he was given. Because apparently being a living legend wasn't impressive enough, he had to be a walking filing cabinet too. Despite the danger, the racism, and the sheer size of the territory he patrolled, Reeves never backed down. He was the real deal. A lawman who didn't just enforce the law, he embodied it. Some even speculate he was the inspiration for the Lone Ranger, though unlike the masked cowboy, Bass didn't need a disguise. Just a badge and a very persuasive revolver. But while Reeves was out there, bringing in thousands with grit and honor, another kind of lawman was making waves. One who preferred to work from the shadows, under aliases, and with a pen in one hand and a pistol in the other. Now, Charlie Siringo, Pinkerton agent and undercover bounty hunter. Because sometimes justice wore a fake mustache and wrote its own memoir. If Bass Reeves was the badge, wearing paragon of frontier justice, then Charlie Siringo was the guy in the shadows with a fake name, a notebook, and a revolver tucked under his coat. Born in 1855 in Texas, Siringo started out as a cowboy, then wrote a best-selling memoir about it. Because apparently wrangling cattle wasn't exciting enough, he had to become the first cowboy turned author. But his real fame came when he joined the Pinkerton National Detective Agency in 1886, using Pat Garrett's name as a reference, because name-dropping was alive and well in the 19th century. Siringo was the original undercover cowboy. He infiltrated gangs, unions, and outlaw hideouts using aliases like Charles Leon Allison and Charles L. Carter, which sounds like the frontier version of a guy with too many burner phones. He chased rustlers in Texas, robbers in Alaska, and even went toe-to-toe with Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch. He logged over 25,000 miles in the saddle, all while pretending to be someone else and taking notes for his next book. Because yes, he kept writing. And the Pinkertons hated it. They tried to sue him into silence more than once, which is how you know he was doing something right. Siringo's life was a blur of disguises, danger, and dramatic flair. He was part detective, part bounty hunter, part author, and all trouble. He believed in justice, sure, but he also believed in getting the story, even if it meant bending a few rules and stepping on a few toes. Sometimes literally, if the saloon was crowded. But for all his grit and gumption, Siringo wasn't alone in the morally murky middle ground of frontier justice. There were others, men who walked the line between hero and hired gun, lawman and legend, saint and scoundrel. Now, Jack Duncan, Tom Tobin, Christopher, Kit, Carson, morally murky figures because in the Wild West, even the good guys had blood on their boots and secrets in their saddlebags. Jack Duncan, Tom Tobin, Christopher, Kit, Carson. 3 names that sound like they belong on a heroic monument, or maybe a whiskey label. But in the morally murky world of the Wild West, these men were less white hat and more shades of grey with a dash of gunpowder. A Jack Duncan was a lawman, sure, but also a man who didn't mind bending the rules like a horseshoe in a blacksmith's forge. He was known to enforce the law with one hand, while quietly ignoring it with the other, especially if the other hand was holding a bottle or a bribe. Duncan's justice was swift, decisive, and occasionally based on whether he liked your boots. Tom Tobin, meanwhile, was the kind of man who could track a ghost through a sandstorm. A legendary scout and tracker, Tobin once hunted down the infamous Espinosa brothers, serial killers who made the rest of the frontier look like choir boys. When Tobin brought back proof of their demise, it wasn't a signed confession or a polite note. No, he delivered their heads in a sack to a military officer, who promptly turned green and had to sit down. Tobin claimed he wasn't in it for the bounty, just doing it for humanity's sake, which is exactly what someone says when they show up with a bag of heads and a straight face. And then there's Christopher, Kit Carson, a man so famous they named everything from cities to cereal mascots after him. Carson was a fur trapper, scout, soldier, an occasional Indian agent. He spoke multiple Native American languages, had deep relationships with many tribes, and then, plot twist, led brutal campaigns against some of those same tribes during the Indian Wars. He was a hero to some, a villain to others, and a walking contradiction to everyone else. If the West had a patron saint of moral ambiguity, it might just be Kit Carson, holding a rifle in one hand and a peace treaty in the other. These men weren't outlaws, exactly, but they weren't saints either. They lived in a world where the line between justice and vengeance was drawn in dust and erased by bootprints. And speaking of outlaws, let's talk about the ones who didn't wear badges. The ones with prices on their heads and legends in their wake. Outlaws with prices on their heads. Jesse James, a 10,000 bounty, betrayed by Robert Ford. Because nothing says, "Thank you for your trust," like shooting someone while they're adjusting a picture frame. If the Wild West had a Mount Rushmore of outlaws, Jesse James would be front and center, probably tipping his hat and robbing the sculptor. A former Confederate guerrilla turned folk hero, Jesse James was the poster child for post-Civil War outlaw chick. He robbed banks, trains, and occasionally the public's sense of moral clarity. To some, he was a Robin Hood figure. To others, he was just a guy with a gun and a flair for dramatic exits. By the early 1880s, Jesse was living under the alias Thomas Howard. Insane, Joseph, Missouri, trying to keep a low profile, which is hard to do when there's a 10,000 bounty on your head and your mustache is famous. That bounty, offered by Missouri Governor Thomas Crittenden and funded by railroad and express companies, was enough to make even Jesse's closest friends reconsider their loyalties. Enter Robert Ford, a young member of Jesse's gang who admired him so much he decided to shoot him in the back of the head. On April 3, 1882, while Jesse was adjusting a picture on the wall, because even outlaws appreciate good interior design, Ford pulled the trigger and ended the legend. Jesse never saw it coming. Literally. Ford and his brother Charlie had struck a deal with the governor: kill Jesse, get the reward, and receive a full pardon. And they did. But instead of being hailed as heroes, the Ford brothers were branded cowards. Robert Ford became a pariah, a man who shot a folk hero in cold blood. He tried to cash in on his infamy by reenacting the murder on stage, yes, really, but public opinion never forgave him. He was eventually shot and killed himself, because karma in the Wild West rides a fast horse. Jesse James, meanwhile, became a legend. Songs were written, stories were told, and his grave became a tourist attraction. In death, he became larger than life, an outlaw saint with a six-shooter halo. But Jesse wasn't the only young gun to capture the public's imagination. Just a few states over, another legend was being forged. One with a baby face, a quick draw, and a knack for escaping jail. Billy the Kid, hunted by Pat Garrett. Because sometimes the line between lawman and legend is drawn with a bullet. If Jesse James was the outlaw with a flair for drama, Billy the Kid was the one with a flair for vanishing. Born Henry McCarty, or possibly William H. Bonney, depending on which alias he was using that week, Billy was the ultimate teenage troublemaker. Except instead of sneaking out past curfew, he was sneaking out of jail. Repeatedly. By the time he was 21, Billy had allegedly killed 21 men, though historians suspect the real number was closer to 8. Still, that didn't stop dime novels from turning him into a gunslinging prodigy with a cherubic face and a hair-trigger temper. He was charming, fluent in Spanish, and had a knack for escaping custody like it was a competitive sport. Enter Pat Garrett, a former bartender, buffalo hunter, a newly elected sheriff of Lincoln County, New Mexico. Garrett had once rubbed elbows with Billy in Fort Sumner. But when he got the badge, he made it his mission to bring the kid in. Preferably alive, but let's be honest, he wasn't going to lose sleep either way. The chase was long, dusty, and filled with near misses. Garrett finally captured Billy in December 1880, and the kid was sentenced to hang. But in true Billy fashion, he escaped, killing 2 deputies in the process and riding off into legend. Garrett tracked him down again in July 1881. This time, there was no dramatic shootout, no high noon standoff, just a quiet night in Fort Sumner, a dark room, and a single gunshot. Garrett claimed Billy walked into the room and asked, "Quietness, so, who is it?" before being shot dead. Whether that's true, or just a poetic flourish, we'll never know. But Garrett got the credit, and the controversy. He even wrote a book about it, because nothing says closure like publishing your own version of events. Billy the Kid died young, but his legend aged like whiskey in a sun-baked barrel. Songs were sung, movies were made, and conspiracy theories bloomed like desert flowers. Some say he wasn't killed at all. Some say he lived to old age under a new name. But one thing's for sure, the kid became a symbol of rebellion, youth, and the kind of outlaw charm that made lawmen nervous and storytellers giddy. And while Billy was dodging bullets and headlines in New Mexico, a different kind of outlaw duo was making waves further west. Less teenage angst, more buddy comedy with explosives. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Because sometimes crime does pay, until Bolivia gets involved. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. 2 names that sound like they should be selling outlaw, branded cologne, but instead became the most charming train. Robbers this side of the Rockies. Robert Leroy Parker, aka Butch Cassidy, and Harry Longabaugh, aka the Sundance Kid, weren't just criminals. They were charismatic criminals. The kind who robbed you, tipped their hats, and made you feel like you'd just been part of a very polite heist. Leaders of the infamous Wild Bunch. They specialized in robbing banks and trains with a flair that made lawmen weep and Pinkertons lose sleep. Their robberies were often so well timed and theatrical, it's a wonder they didn't sell tickets. Butch was the brains. Clever, a fable, and always thinking 2 steps ahead. Sundance was the muscle. Quiet, deadly accurate with a pistol, and allergic to small talk. After a string of increasingly bold robberies, the heat got too intense. The Pinkertons were on their trail, like a bloodhound with a grudge, and the Wild West was getting a little too lawful. So what did Butch and Sundance do? They packed up and moved to Bolivia, because when you've robbed every train in Wyoming, international expansion just makes sense. In Bolivia, they tried to go straight. Briefly, they worked as payroll guards for a mining company, which went about as well as you'd expect. After a shootout with bandits, and the awkward realization that they were better at robbing than protecting, they returned to their old ways, robbing banks in broken Spanish and dodging bullets with flair. Their story ended in 1908 in the town of San Vicente, Bolivia, where they were cornered by local authorities. The details are murky, but it's believed they died in a shootout, possibly by their own hands to avoid capture. Or maybe they escaped and lived out their days selling churros under assumed names. The legend lives on. But while Butch and Sundance were dodging Pinkertons and perfecting their bilingual banditry, others were playing the bounty game with a little more creativity. Some manipulated bounties to eliminate rivals or surrender for their own reward. Because why rob a bank when you can rob the system? Because why just chase the system when you can game it? In the Wild West, where the law was more of a suggestion and ethics were optional, bounty manipulation became a side hustle for the morally flexible. Some outlaws realized that if there was money to be made turning in criminals, then all they had to do was make sure the criminal in question was someone they didn't like. Rival gang leader. Slap a bounty on him. Annoying neighbor who borrowed your saddle and never returned it. Suddenly he's wanted for horse theft. All it took was a little creative storytelling and a sheriff who was tired, drunk, or both. And then there were the self-surrenderers. Outlaws who turned themselves in for their own bounty. Yes, really. They'd use an alias, collect the reward through a friend or bribed official, and then escape. Custody, only to repeat the process in the next town over. It was the frontier version of cash, back fraud, except with more gunpowder and fewer receipts. One particularly bold outlaw allegedly shaved his beard, turned himself in, collected the bounty, then grew it back and did it again. Twice, in the same county. Some bounty hunters even made deals with their targets. I'll bring you in alive, you'll serve a few months, and we'll split the reward. It was like a loyalty program for criminals. Others just skipped the middleman and framed innocent people entirely. Because when the reward poster doesn't come with a photo, close enough becomes a legal defense. This bounty manipulation wasn't just clever, it was dangerous. It blurred the line between justice and opportunism, turning the frontier into a place where the most profitable crime was pretending to fight crime. And when the law looked the other way, or worse, played along, things got darker. Vigilantes and legal murder. Many bounty hunters operated like freelance executioners. Because when the system pays you to kill, some folks stop asking who deserves it. They weren't just chasing fugitives, they were delivering final judgments with a six-shooter and a shrug. In theory, bounty hunters were supposed to apprehend criminals and bring them to justice. In practice, many acted like the judge, jury, and very enthusiastic executioner. If the wanted poster said, "dead or alive," they often read that as, "dead," preferably before lunch. These weren't the clean, cut lawmen of dime novels. These were men who saw a bounty not as a civic duty, but as a business opportunity, and in business, efficiency mattered. Why risk a shootout, a jailbreak, or a long ride back to town with a chatty outlaw when you could just solve the problem permanently? Some bounty hunters developed reputations for being especially decisive. They'd ride into town with a body, a bullet-riddled wanted poster, and a story that started with, "he drew first," and ended with, Now where's my money? And unless someone had the nerve to question them, which, let's be honest, most didn't, they got paid and rode off into the sunset, possibly humming a jaunty tune. The legal system, such as it was, often turned a blind eye. After all, the outlaw was dead, the town was safer, and the paperwork was minimal. But this casual approach to justice blurred the line between law enforcement and murder for hire. Some bounty hunters were little more than licensed killers with a flair for dramatic exits. And when even that thin veneer of legality wore off, towns took matters into their own hands. Towns formed vigilante committees, bounties with no legal basis. Because when the law was too slow, the rope was always ready. In the law-starved corners of the American frontier, some towns decided that waiting for justice was just too slow and possibly bad for business. So they took matters into their own caroused, whiskey-scented hands and formed vigilante committees. These were self-appointed groups of concerned citizens who believed that justice should be swift, decisive, and preferably involve a tree limb and a short speech. These committees weren't exactly picky about legal procedure. No warrants, no trials, no appeals, just a vote, a rope, and a very dramatic sunrise. They claimed to uphold order, but their definition of order often depended on who was loudest, angriest, or owed the least in bar tabs. Some were formed to combat real crime, banditry, rustling, murder. Others were more about settling scores, protecting property, or making sure the wrong sort of people didn't get too comfortable. And the bounties. Oh, they handed those out like candy at a church picnic. No legal authority, no oversight, just a handwritten note nailed to a post. 200 for Jed, the fence jumper, McGraw. Dead preferred. 11 if he's quiet. These bounties were often based on hearsay, grudges, or the fact that someone's cousin swore they saw Jed looking suspicious near a chicken coop. In places like San Francisco, Virginia City, and Montana's mining camps, vigilante groups like the 601 or Committee of Vigilance became infamous for their swift justice and even swifter hangings. Some claimed to be restoring order. Others were just making sure their rivals didn't live long enough to dispute land claims. And when these committees weren't busy stringing up suspected criminals, they were often knee-deep in range wars, cattle feuds, and revenge killings disguised as justice. Because nothing says community values like a land dispute that ends in a shootout and a suspiciously well-timed bounty poster. In the late 19th century West, the open range was less a peaceful expanse of grazing land and more a powder keg with hooves. As settlers, ranchers, and opportunists poured into the frontier, land and water became the most valuable and violently contested resources around. The result? A series of bloody conflicts that made courtroom dramas look like quilting bees. Range wars were the Wild West's version of corporate mergers, except with more dynamite and fewer lawyers. Cattle barons, who had long enjoyed the luxury of letting their herds roam free across public land, suddenly found themselves fenced out by homesteaders invoking the Homestead Act. These newcomers, armed with barbed wire and legal deeds, dared to claim land and water for themselves. The nerve. The cattlemen responded with classic frontier diplomacy: arson, intimidation, and the occasional hired gun. Fence cutting became a full-time job. Water sources were poisoned. Entire families were run off their land. Or worse. The Johnson County War in Wyoming is a prime example. Cattle barons hired mercenaries to eliminate suspected rustlers, only to be met by a 400-man posse of angry settlers who laid siege to them, like it was medieval Europe with better hats. Then there were the cattle feuds, which were like range wars, but with more personal vendettas and fewer survivors. These often started with a missing cow and ended with a multi-generational bloodbath. Families like the Hatfields and McCoys may have gotten the headlines, but dozens of lesser-known feuds raged across the frontier, fueled by pride, whiskey, and a complete lack of conflict resolution training. And let's not forget the revenge killings disguised as justice. If someone stole your cattle, insulted your sister, or looked at your fence funny, you could slap a bounty on them and call it law enforcement. Vigilante committees would back you up, especially if you brought donuts to the meeting. The line between justice and vengeance wasn't just blurry. It was trampled by a dozen angry horses. But as the West got richer, the motives got sheenier. Killing for gold, not law. Because when there's a nugget in the river, suddenly everyone's a judge, jury, and prospector with a grudge. As the gold rush fever swept across the American West, the promise of instant wealth turned dusty towns into powder kegs. Justice, already a loose concept on the frontier, became downright negotiable when gold entered the picture. Suddenly, every creek bed was a potential crime scene, and every prospector was either a target or a suspect, sometimes both before breakfast. Bounties weren't just for outlaws anymore. They became tools in land grabs, mining disputes, and good old-fashioned greed. Claim jumpers would accuse rivals of crimes, just to get them out of the way. And if the sheriff didn't bite, a vigilante committee might. A whispered accusation, a hastily scribbled wanted poster, and boom, someone's digging a shallow grave behind the assay office. And bounty hunters. They weren't immune to the sparkle. Some took jobs not because the target was dangerous, but because he was sitting on a gold vein. Others were hired by mining companies to discourage labor organizers or rival claimants. Discouragement often delivered via rifle. The line between bounty hunter and hired thug blurred faster than a gold pan in a flash flood. Even towns got in on the action. Local officials, eager to protect their booming economies, sometimes offered bounties not for justice, but for stability. Translation: get rid of the troublemaker, and we'll pretend it was legal. And if that troublemaker just happened to own a lucrative claim, well, that was just a shiny coincidence. But while the men of the frontier were busy shooting each other over shiny rocks, there were others, less expected, often overlooked, who carved out their own place in the bounty world. Women and minorities in the bounty world: Stagecoach Mary, Pearl Hart, and rumors of female bounty trackers. Because sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room wasn't the one with the biggest gun. It was the one no one saw coming. Let's start with Stagecoach Mary Fields, a 6-foot-tall, cigar-smoking, whiskey-drinking powerhouse who could outshoot, outdrink, and outcurse most men west of the Mississippi. Born into slavery around 1832, Mary gained her freedom after the Civil War and eventually found her way to Montana, where she became the first African-American woman to work as a U.S. mail carrier. She earned the nickname Stagecoach Mary for her fearless delivery runs through snow, wolves, and the occasional bandit. While not a bounty hunter in the traditional sense, Mary's grit, marksmanship, and reputation for settling disputes with a shotgun made her a frontier legend, and a woman you absolutely did not want to mess with. Then there's Pearl Hart, the so-called bandit queen. In 1899 she cut her hair, donned men's clothing, and robbed a stagecoach in Arizona with a partner named Joe Boot. She reportedly gave each passenger $1 back for lunch, which is either oddly polite or wildly confusing. Pearl was eventually caught, imprisoned, and became a media sensation. She posed for photos, gave interviews, and even kept a pet bobcat in jail. Because why not? Though she was an outlaw, not a bounty hunter. Her story sparked rumors and legends of other women who might have taken up the badge, or the bounty, undercover. And those rumors of female bounty trackers. They're hard to pin down, but they persist like tumbleweeds in a ghost town. Some stories tell of women who disguised themselves as men to hunt fugitives. Others speak of widows who took up the gun after their husbands were killed, tracking down the killers for justice or revenge. While official records are scarce, because history wasn't exactly great at documenting women who didn't fit the mold, the whispers remain women who rode hard, shot straight, and collected their pay without ever revealing their true names. But while women were breaking molds and busting myths, another group was navigating the bounty world from a very different, and often tragic, angle. Native Americans, hunted and sometimes recruited, because in the West, survival meant playing every side of the game. For many Native Americans, the bounty system was a brutal double-edged tomahawk. On one side, they were hunted, targeted by settlers, militias, and even the US government, which at times placed bounties on native individuals or entire tribes. These weren't just for alleged crimes, sometimes the crime was simply existing on land someone else wanted. In the 1800s, some states offered cash rewards for native scalps, a grotesque and dehumanizing practice that turned genocide into a business model. It wasn't justice, it was extermination with a price tag. But on the other side of that blade, some Native Americans were recruited as scouts, trackers, and guides. Their deep knowledge of the land, unmatched tracking skills, and ability to move silently through terrain that left others wheezing made them invaluable to the US Army and bounty hunters alike. Tribes like the Apache, Crow, and Pawnee often allied with US forces against rival tribes or outlaws, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes for survival, and sometimes for revenge. These native scouts were both respected and exploited. They were praised for their skills, yet rarely given the same recognition or pay as their white counterparts. They were essential to frontier law enforcement, yet remained outsiders in the very system they helped uphold. It was a grim irony. The same people who were once hunted became the hunters, navigating a world where loyalty was transactional and justice was a moving target. And they weren't alone in walking that tightrope. Hispanic and black bounty hunters faced discrimination, but often succeeded in lawless zones, because when the law looked down on you, the lawless looked sideways, and sometimes that was all the opening you needed. In the Wild West, being a bounty hunter was already a risky gig. Now imagine doing it while being treated like you weren't even allowed in the saloon, unless it was to mop the floor. Black and Hispanic bounty hunters had to navigate not only bullets and bandits, but also racism, suspicion, and the occasional, accidental, wanted poster with their face on it. Despite this, many of them thrived, especially in the lawless zones, where the only thing that mattered was whether you could ride fast, shoot straight, and bring back the guy with the price tag on his head. In places where sheriffs were scarce and justice was more of a suggestion. Skill trumped skin color. If you could track a fugitive through a canyon in the dark while dodging rattlesnakes and unpaid bar tabs, you earned respect. Grudgingly, maybe, but respect nonetheless. Some of these hunters became legends in their own right, though history often forgot to write their names down. They worked the same trails, faced the same dangers, and cashed the same blood-stained rewards as their white counterparts, just with fewer use and more side glances. And while they were out there doing the hard work, another group was redefining what it meant to chase criminals, only with fancier suits, bigger mustaches, and a logo that looked like it belonged on a jar of pickles. Pinkertons and Private Loth. Pinkerton National Detective Agency, the first private FBI. Because when the government's too slow, just hire your own army and slap a slogan on it. Founded in 1850 by Scottish immigrant Alan Pinkerton, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency was the original "we'll handle it" outfit. Before the FBI, before the Secret Service, before anyone thought to put detective on a business card, there were the Pinkertons, armed with revolvers, notebooks, and a logo that was literally a giant unblinking eye. Their motto: 1. Never sleep. Which is either a bold commitment to vigilance or a cry for help from someone who's had too much coffee. Pinkerton made his name by allegedly foiling a plot to assassinate President-elect Abraham Lincoln in 1861. After that, Lincoln hired him to run intelligence operations during the Civil War. So yes, the man went from making barrels to running a spy ring in about a decade. Overachiever much. The agency quickly became the go-to solution for everything from espionage to strike breaking to please find my missing payroll before my close at the first criminal mustache base called the Roggies and were early doctors of hiring women and minorities as detectives, which was shockingly progressive for an outfit that also occasionally solved problems with dynamite. At their peak, the Pinkertons were so powerful that Congress passed the Anti-Pinkerton Act in 1893 to stop the government from hiring them. That's right, they were banned from federal contracts for being too good at their job, or too terrifying, or both. But before they were breaking strikes and getting banned by Congress, they were doing something a little more straightforward: hired to protect trains, banks, and hunt criminals. Because when your gold shipment's late, you don't call customer service, you call the Pinkertons. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was the 19th century version of Have Badge, Will Travel. Railroads and banks were hemorrhaging money, thanks to outlaws with dynamite and dreams. So they turned to the Pinkertons, who showed up with ledgers, revolvers, and a suspicious number of aliases. These weren't your average deputies. These were menace, and a few trailblazing women who wore suits to gunfights and took notes while dodging bullets. They protected trains like overprotective parents at a school dance, riding shotgun, hiding in luggage compartments, and occasionally disguising themselves as passengers, just waiting for a bandit to say the magic words. Hands up. Banks loved them too, especially when their vaults kept getting lighter, and their tellers kept getting nervous twitches. And when it came to hunting criminals, the Pinkertons didn't just chase, they pursued. Across states, territories, and time zones, they tracked Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, Jesse James, and anyone else who thought wanted. Posters were a good look. If you were on the run and a Pinkerton was on your trail, you had two options: surrender or start digging a tunnel to Argentina. But they didn't just rely on grit and gunpowder. Oh no. The Pinkertons had a playbook that would make a spy agency blush. Tactics included infiltration, assassination, and manhunts. Because sometimes justice wears a disguise, carries a notebook, and knows where you sleep. The Pinkertons weren't just detectives. They were the Swiss Army knives of frontier law enforcement. If Swiss Army knives came with mustaches and a tendency to shoot first, when it came to infiltration, they were masters of disguise. One day they were a cattle rustler named Slim. The next a disgruntled miner named Dusty Pete. They'd embed themselves in outlaw gangs, labor unions, or anywhere someone might be plotting a train robbery or a strongly worded protest. Their goal? Gather intel, earn trust, and then, surprise! Everyone's under arrest and your new best friend was actually a Pinkerton with a notepad and a warrant. Assassination was the tactic they definitely didn't advertise on the business card. But let's just say some targets didn't make it to trial. Whether it was a resisting arrest situation or a tripped and fell on 6 bullets scenario, the Pinkertons had a knack for making problems disappear permanently. Especially if those problems were named Jesse James or Butch Cassidy. And then there were the manhunts. Epic. cross-country chases that made bounty hunters look like mall cops. The Pinkertons would pursue fugitives across deserts, mountains, and international borders, with the persistence of a tax collector and the charm of a rattlesnake in a bowler hat. They didn't stop until the target was in cuffs, in a coffin, or in Canada. But for all their skill and success, the Pinkertons weren't exactly beloved. They were feared more than admired, even by lawmen. Because when the guys who are supposed to help you start showing up with dossiers, disguises, and a suspicious lack of blinking, you start locking your own doors. The Pinkertons weren't just a detective agency, they were a walking paradox. On one hand, they were hired to uphold law and order. On the other, they operated with the subtlety of a sledgehammer and the ethics of a poker cheat. Local sheriffs often found themselves caught between admiration and anxiety. Sure, the Pinkertons could track down a fugitive halfway across the continent, but they might also burn down a barn, bribe a witness, and publish a memoir about it before the sheriff even finished his coffee. Some lawmen resented them for their resources. Others feared them for their reach. And a few just didn't like being upstaged by a guy in a bowler hat who could quote Shakespeare while reloading a revolver. The Pinkertons answered to no town, no badge, and sometimes not even the law itself. They were the original, we work alone types. Except they brought a small army and a filing cabinet. But as the West began to change, even the Pinkertons couldn't outrun progress. The railroad and the death of the frontier, as the West modernized, bounty hunting became less needed. Because when trains start arriving on time, outlaws start running out of places to hide. By the late 1800s, the Wild West was getting a little less wild and a lot more scheduled. Railroads stitched the frontier together like a corset on a Sunday morning. Telegraphs buzzed with news, faster than a galloping horse, and towns that once had more saloons than laws suddenly had ordinances. Civilization, it seemed, had arrived, and it brought paperwork. With this new infrastructure came professional law enforcement. No longer did towns have to rely on a guy named Buckshot Bill, who smelled like regret and claimed to be a bounty hunter because he once tackled a drunk guy behind a barn. Now they had actual sheriffs, deputies, and U.S. Marshals, people with badges, jurisdictions, and at least a passing familiarity with due process. The romantic image of the lone bounty hunter riding into town with a hog-tied outlaw and a dramatic backstory started to fade. Why hire a freelance gunman when you could just send a telegram to the next county and have a warrant waiting? Why risk a shootout when you could have a trial? And so, the bounty hunter, once a staple of frontier justice, began to look more like a relic than a necessity. The job didn't vanish overnight, but it definitely got pushed to the margins, somewhere between snake oil salesman and professional duelist. Because now, when justice came calling, it didn't wear spurs and a scowl. Marshals, judges, jails replaced barroom justice. And suddenly, a needed killing wasn't a valid legal defense anymore. As the frontier settled and towns grew into cities with more than one street and a functioning post office, the old ways of handling justice, namely, shouting accusations over poker games and settling disputes with pistols, started to feel a bit outdated. Enter the marshals, judges, and jails, the holy trinity of civilized law enforcement. Marshals brought a sense of order, or at least a sense of paperwork. They served warrants, escorted prisoners, and occasionally broke up bar fights with the kind of authority that only comes from wearing a badge and a hat large enough to double as a shade structure. Judges, meanwhile, replaced the old jury of whoever's in the saloon with actual legal proceedings. Trials became less about who had the loudest voice and more about who had the best lawyer, or at least the cleanest boots. And jails? Oh, Jails were a game changer. No more tying people to hitching posts or locking them in the general store's broom closet. Now there were actual cells with bars and keys and everything. It was like the West had discovered consequences. This shift didn't happen overnight, but as towns grew and railroads brought in more people seconds and more lawyers, the demand for real justice systems grew louder than a drunk cowboy on payday. The days of vigilante hangings and bounty hunter justice were fading, replaced by courtrooms, clerks, and the occasional sternly worded summons. And as these towns swelled into cities, something even more structured began to take shape. Something with uniforms, patrol routes, and a suspicious fondness for whistles. Urban police systems began forming in growing cities, because eventually someone had to write down who actually started the bar fight. As towns ballooned into cities and the saloon to church ratio started to even out, the old frontier model of justice, featuring bounty hunters, vigilantes, and the occasional citizen with a rope and a grudge, just didn't cut it anymore. Enter the urban police force, uniformed, organized, and in theory, trained to handle crime with something resembling professionalism. Cities like Boston and New York led the charge in the mid-1800s, establishing full-time police departments with ranks, patrol beats, and actual paychecks. Officers swapped spurs for whistles, and instead of chasing outlaws across deserts, they now chased pickpockets through alleyways. The job shifted from "bring him in dead or alive" to "please fill out this incident report in triplicate." These new police systems brought structure, accountability, and, let's be honest, a lot more paperwork. They also brought uniforms, which made it harder to pretend you were just a concerned citizen with a nightstick. And while corruption and political meddling were still very much on the menu, the days of freelance justice were clearly numbered. As cities modernized, the bounty hunter began to look less like a rugged hero and more like a liability with a license to shoot. The profession didn't vanish overnight, but it definitely lost its spotlight. The profession faded or went underground, because when the law gets organized, the lone wolf either retires or starts howling from the shadows. As the West settled into rail schedules and rotary phones, the bounty hunter's heyday quietly rode off into the sunset, with formal police forces, court systems, and actual filing cabinets replacing whiskey-soaked wanted posters. The need for freelance justice dwindled. Towns no longer needed a mysterious stranger with a six-shooter and a questionable moral compass. They had clerks now. And paperwork. So much paperwork. Some bounty hunters hung up their spurs and tried their hand at more respectable trades, like saloon ownership or retired legend. Others didn't go quietly. They slipped into the shadows, taking jobs that were less about justice and more about problem solving. Think debt collection with a side of intimidation, or private security with a suspicious number of bullet holes. The profession didn't vanish. It just stopped advertising. The romantic image of the lone gunman tracking fugitives across the plains gave way to something murkier, quieter, and far less photogenic. But the legend, oh, that didn't fade. Because while the bounty hunter disappeared from the streets, he exploded onto the page. From frontier to folklore, dime novels romanticized bounty hunters because nothing sells like a good shootout, a mysterious past, and a hero who never reloads. As the real-life bounty hunters faded into obscurity or quietly took up less shooty professions, the printing presses cranked up and gave them a second life. This time in glorious, exaggerated, borderline ridiculous fashion. Dime novels, those cheap, sensational paperbacks that cost, well, a dime, turned dusty drifters into larger-than-life legends. These stories didn't care much for facts. They cared about drama. And if that meant turning a half, drunk tracker into a brooding avenger with a tragic past, and a horse named Vengeance. So be it. In these tales, bounty hunters were always the fastest draw, the sharpest wit, and somehow never needed to reload. They had names like Lightning Jack, Did-I Dan, or the Phantom Marshal, and they never just arrested someone. They delivered justice with a dramatic monologue and a well-timed thunderclap. The villains were cartoonishly evil, the townsfolk eternally grateful, and the saloons always had just one last bottle of whiskey. These stories were wildly popular, especially with readers back east, who had never seen a cactus in their lives. They devoured tales of frontier justice, imagining a world where one man or occasionally one very determined woman could clean up a town with nothing but grit, a revolver, and a steely gaze. Reality, optional. Entertainment, guaranteed. And as the printing presses gave way to projectors, the bounty hunter didn't ride off into the sunset. He rode straight onto the silver screen. Films made them heroes, anti-heroes, or monsters because nothing says character development like a close-up, a squint, and a morally ambiguous body count. Hollywood took one look at the bounty hunter and said, yes, but what if he was cooler? And thus began a cinematic love affair that turned dusty desperados into icons of grit, swagger, and questionable ethics. From the stoic silence of Clint Eastwood's Man, with no name, to the chaotic charm of Django, the bounty hunter became a screen staple, sometimes a hero, sometimes a villain, and often something deliciously in between. In classic westerns, they were lone wolves with mysterious pasts and perfect aim. In spaghetti westerns, they were stylish, cynical, and allergic to small talk. And in modern films, they're everything from tragic anti-heroes to full-blown monsters with a badge and a vendetta. Think Boba Fett, The Mandalorian, or Anton Chigurh. Characters who blur the line between justice and obsession, law and lunacy. These portrayals didn't just entertain, they mythologized. They turned bounty hunters into symbols of rugged independence, moral ambiguity, and the eternal struggle between order and chaos. They made us root for the guy who might shoot the villain, or be the villain. And they did it with sweeping scores, dramatic sunsets, and more slow motion gunfights than you can shake a spurred boot at. But behind the cinematic squints and stylized shootouts lies a truth that's far less glamorous. The truth they were messy, brutal, desperate, because real bounty hunters didn't ride into town with theme music. They rode in hungry broke, and hoping the guy they were chasing didn't shoot first. In the Wild West, justice was just another business. Because when the sheriff's office is closed, and the saloon's still open, someone's got to turn a profit. Forget noble ideals and courtroom dramas. On the frontier, justice was often less about right and wrong, and more about supply and demand. Got a grudge? Put a price on it. Got a rival? Call it a crime. The legal system, such as it was, ran on whiskey, whispers, and whatever currency jingled loudest. Judges were sometimes elected by popularity contests, read who bought the most rounds, and trials could be shorter than a poker hand, especially if the jury was already drunk. Wealthy landowners, railroad tycoons, and mining magnates didn't wait for justice. They hired it. They paid for protection, prosecution, and occasionally a little preemptive punishment. If you had money, you could buy a posse. If you didn't, well, you'd better be fast or invisible. Justice wasn't blind. It just squinted at the highest bidder. And in this dusty marketplace of morality, one profession thrived like a buzzard at a buffet. And bounty hunters were the middlemen of blood. Because when justice is for sale, someone's got to deliver the receipts, preferably hog-tied and still breathing. They weren't saints. They weren't always sinners. They were the ones who rode between the lines, between law and lawlessness, between order and chaos, between wanted and foops. Too late. They worked for gold, for grudges, for glory, and sometimes just for the thrill of the chase. They were the freelancers of frontier justice, the gig workers of gunfights, the original. I don't need a boss. I've got a bounty crowd. Some were noble, some were nightmares. Most were just trying to make a living in a world where the rules changed with the wind, and the sheriff's badge didn't always mean what it said on the tin. They were the middlemen of blood, paid in coin, remembered in legend, and occasionally buried under the wrong name. Now, before you drift off dreaming of dusty trails and dramatic standoffs, a quick disclaimer. We've done our best to stick to the historical facts, but hey, this is the Wild West we're talking about. Records were spotty, memories were fuzzy, and some folks lied for a living. So if we got a date wrong, a name twisted, or exaggerated how many cigars Stagecoach Mary could smoke in one sitting, chalk it up to frontier flair. Now close your eyes, partner. Let the tumbleweeds roll, the campfire crackle, and the ghosts of bounty hunters ride quietly into your dreams. Sleep tight. And don't worry, there's no bounty on you. Probably